Eugene, Oregon is an amazing city that we are all grateful to live in. With its cultural, artistic, educational, professional, and natural amenities. We have gained a reputation as a desirable place to live, and our population continues to grow year after year. After all, who wouldn't want to live here? Eugene is seeing new educational, athletic, occupational, and municipal development, placing Eugene as a city on the rise economically and in quality of life. Unfortunately, living in Eugene is becoming less and less accessible. Housing prices and rents are rising at rates far faster than the average income. This housing crisis is driven by a lack of supply and accessibility of new homes, leading to growing insecurity within renters and those seeking new or future homes. Even among those with secure housing, Eugenians are seeing the effects of this issue secondhand, as over 1,600 unsheltered individuals live in Eugene. To gain a better understanding of this issue, we spoke to several local elected officials and neighborhood leaders.
All right. Well, I am Eliza Kaczynski. I'm a member of WeCan, which is the Walkable Eugene Citizen Advisory Network. WeCan is a group that looks at housing choice and affordability and transportation choice in Eugene and tries to help advocate to increase options for that. We've been around for about 4 years now and worked a lot, particularly surrounding like zoning related issues like that. In addition to WeCan, I also am on the budget committee for the city of Eugene and participated in the housing tools and strategies focus groups. So lots of different activities surrounding this.
Well, first of all, hi, I'm Marty Wilde. I'm the state representative for House
start.
District 11, which includes Milton Park in areas from the university down to Creswell, around Springfield, and all the way up into Lynn County.
Okay, great. This is Mayor Lucy Vennis.
My name is David Monk. I'm the chair of the Southeast Neighborhood Association.
We asked our interviewees what the visible effects of the housing crisis are.
About the housing crisis, I hear a lot about affordability, both sort of at the very low end in terms of not enough supportive and low-income housing.
I work for an organization that is a nonprofit, and I watch my coworkers sort of struggle to find housing that they can afford while also paying their student loans. I think you see it in an increase in homelessness, where people who are on the edge of being able to afford housing, and when the rises costs push them out.
I have two 20-year-olds that live in my house who can't afford rent. You know, they're going to school and they would like to not be living with their parents, but they can't afford to. So that's, you know, that's the spectrum of South Eugene.
You see people who have secure housing, and that housing gets sold, or the rents rise, and then they have to scramble to find new housing. You see sort of the quality of life for people in Eugene decreasing as they're having difficulty finding housing that they can afford.
How do we address the problem of homelessness?
So what the city is doing, again, in partnership with the county, is that we are planning the implementation around 10 recommendations that we received from a homeless services and shelter feasibility study by the Technical Assistance Collaborative. So there were 10 recommendations. 9 of them really have to do with delivery of services and construction of housing, and then the 10th has to do with building a shelter. So those 10 points in what we call the TAC report, those are our guidelines. Those are the services that we will be looking to improve.
Well, we've adopted a housing first model. What housing is, I talk about the sort of the spiral staircase out of homelessness. And so, you know, the first step is basic shelter. You know, are we going to have a public shelter? Are we going to have wet beds? And the important thing about having sort of that first step on the spiral staircase is we have other steps there. So if you, let's say you've got a substance abuse problem and you're on the street, well, we have a wet bed for you. And if maybe we have a shelter bed for you, so that, you know, you probably qualify for the Oregon Health Plan. which might be able to provide you with some of the services you need to stay sober, but you're probably not going to make a second appointment if you're sleeping under a bridge. But if you have stable housing at a shelter, maybe you make that second appointment. Maybe you start sober living long enough that you can move into a sober living house. That's another step we want to build. Maybe your life is then stable enough that you can do casual labor and earn some money. That's another step on that staircase. And then, eventually as you progress up the staircase, and sadly there's also a need to have every step on the way down too, because some people do acquire substance abuse problems and stuff like that. And if they fall all the way into dire homelessness, it's a lot harder to get them out. Then if you say, well, maybe we have some supportive living for you over the short term, then maybe you could enter conventional housing again.
Okay.
As a long-term solution, how do we protect renters from sharp increases in rent?
For renters, I think we are living in a pretty harsh climate for renters, and so the city council is looking at some rental protections. The state has looked at it. We've looked at. There's movement on no-cause evictions, and at the very least, if we don't eliminate no-cause evictions, at least extending that timeline on no-cause evictions so people have more time to look for housing. I think. There need to be probably better protections. We have a policy, rental housing program, to support tenants who are living in housing where they feel where it's not up to standard, where there are mold issues or insulation issues or electrical issues or other things, and a landlord has not tended to it. We do have a rental housing program, so I think our goal as a council certainly is to make sure that tenants know that they have access. There is recourse if they're living in housing that doesn't meet standards and where the landlord is slow to improve it. We want tenants to seek recourse, and I think we actually probably need more of that. Again, I think with tenants, it's a supply question. The prices are high, and it's, if you lose your housing through a no-cause eviction, it can be hard to find housing that's in the same price level because it's going up. So I do think there is some abuse of the system by landlords who will no-cause evict a tenant and then be able to raise the rent higher. And so I think we're looking at ways in which how can we provide more protections for tenants. The state's looking at that, the legislature's looking at that. So there are those immediate protections, and then we go back to the same supply question. We have to build more units that people can afford.
Okay. There are 3 different things we're doing. The first one is we're stabilizing people in their rental housing. We passed what's called Senate Bill 608, and it did 2 things, a bunch of things, but 2 big ones. First was to prohibit rent increases of more than 7% plus the consumer price index, which usually works out to 9 or 10% total a year. That prevents these rent shocks that we've been seeing. It also helps with the predatory behavior we've seen with purchasing mobile home parks and then jacking up the rent there. So that was the first thing it did. The second thing it did was eliminate or reduce no-cause evictions. So after the first year, you have some kind of tenure, I guess I would say. There are exceptions to that, but those are the 2 big things that bill did.
How do we create a long-term solution to housing affordability?
Right. Okay. So interestingly, you're right that that we are not going to solve homelessness unless we solve the housing crisis. That's always going to be the bottleneck. So what the commitment that the city has made and that the council has made, we've done 2 big things. First, we approved as a council the creation of a construction excise tax. That's a 1% tax based on the cost associated with building permits, a tax for new construction and renovation, both commercial and residential, and that the revenue from that tax will go into a special housing trust fund. So we can use those funds both to leverage other dollars from other sources, but to enable developers to build housing that is less expensive. So that could be kind of at the subsidized level. It could be working with a provider like St. Vincent de Paul or sponsors or shelter care that's building supportive housing, or it could be with a private developer who wants to build what we call workforce housing, which is housing that is affordable for the lower income level, but not so low that they need subsidized housing. So first of all,
I think that there are lots of things that the city can do. I think really when you look at this issue, there's almost two sets of solutions. One is subsidized housing and creating solutions that provide supports for those who are in the bottom percentiles of income, who are, the market is never going to be able to provide housing that they can afford. The other piece of it is helping facilitate more market rate solutions, because there are not enough subsidies in the world to fund housing for everybody who's cost burdened right now. So I think one of the things the city can do is what they have already sort of started doing, which is looking at things like the construction excise tax to help create more funding for subsidized housing. I think in addition, looking at how they can work to make market rate housing more affordable and more feasible is important, because as we get more houses in place, it will help stabilize the prices.
How do we solve these problems, all while protecting Eugene's natural environment?
We have a great planning rules in Oregon that prevent sprawl, but one flip side of that is it makes land very expensive in the urban growth boundary.
From a climate change perspective, whatever we can do to reduce reliance on automobiles for daily trips is essential, and that requires developing in a more compact fashion, having housing be closer to businesses, to stores, to places where people work, to schools, so that people have the option to walk, bike, or take transit as opposed to driving in their car. And by the same token, doing so takes up less space, which means that we're more able to preserve the areas outside of our urban growth boundary. I think that one of the main things that the city needs to do to look at that is really look at how we have allocated how we use our land and what isn't allowed in certain areas. The city put in its first zoning code in 1935, I believe, and a lot of that was really focused on setting things up so that people could have detached single-family homes with their own yard. About 90% of the city's residential land is zoned for detached single-family homes with their own yard, which is both probably the most expensive and space-consuming form of housing there is. I think looking at how we can strategically provide more options for more compact housing forms like duplexes and triplexes and accessory dwelling units that both provide more options for individuals who maybe a detached single-family home isn't the right thing for them, while at the same time providing housing that makes better use of our limited land supply, and as well is ultimately cheaper to construct than a new single family.
So there was one early proposal that would have allowed fourplexes on every single family detached lot. That has been modified to a proposal that would just say that cities have to make sure that all kinds of housing are available in all zones. And that's sort of a push and pull with local planning authority versus state central planning.
Okay.
So that's second piece.
So the balancing act for us as a community is that we're growing. We don't want to grow too far. We want to protect our parks, our open space. We want to protect our agricultural land, our forest land that's around us. It's very expensive to bump out because you have to build new infrastructure. So we are trying to avoid those costs. So what we'll be looking at as a city is that we're going to be more urban. You know, in the next 20-year cycle, it'll be more urban. We'll be more vertical. We will have more apartment buildings. We will have neighborhoods that have more duplexes in them, probably, and more fourplexes. So, you know, we can anticipate that over the coming decades, this town will have, it'll just be a more vertical town.
What actions can ordinary people take in their own lives to create the change that we want to see?
I'm 61 years of age, and many of the people I work with are older than I am. So it's just like with farmers. We're all stepping off because we've given our time as activists, and we have a few years to get on with some of the other things that we want to do in life. So it's really going to be up to you all to kind of lead this change that's going to happen, and I think it's incumbent upon you to force us, because we're the decision makers, people my age, right? So, and we're kind of stuck in this viewing the world as it was, and we're wanting to keep it stable because many of us are benefiting from the economy as it exists. You're gonna have to challenge that in fundamental ways, and hopefully get people out in the streets protesting, getting people going to city council and to county commissioners meetings, and going to Salem in the thousands, right? So that our elected leaders will listen, and if they don't, throw them out of office and bring in.
One thing that you can do if you already own a detached single-family home and it has a yard is you can try and build an accessory dwelling unit. That is a thing that you can do that will provide more housing for the people in the city, while at the same time possibly providing you with some rental income. I think another thing that you can do is to get involved. These are very complex issues, and the more that our leadership hears that people really care about these issues and really want to find solutions to these problems, the better. And so I would say that those are two main ways.
And then I guess I would say the fundamental thing is you can be involved. You can pay attention. The city council and the planning commission are making very, very difficult choices, and we tend to hear from a very narrow bandwidth of the public. And so it would be helpful to the city council to hear from a broader array of citizens. And one of the, particularly young people, your capacity is someone in their 20s to access housing and keep housing. People are vulnerable, but we don't hear from young people very much. So I think participation in the public process would be great. I would be very interested in hearing from people about how they think we could make it easier for people to offer their opinions. The city is rolling out a new online engagement tool. I haven't seen it yet, but I think will go live this month, and so I'll be very interested to have more people try it out, see if it gives them a way. I'm interested in using it as a more nimble way of asking people just a couple of questions that they could respond to quickly, so that we can take people's temperature when we're thinking about modifying codes around accessory dwelling units, or modifying codes around where we build duplexes, or adjusting transportation corridors. I mean, all of those things, we need to hear from people. And so I would say the average person, the best thing to do is actually pay attention and weigh in.
And sometimes
on some
that's
of
literally in
these
your backyard. There are
issues.
people who have built tiny homes in their backyards. We call them ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. And those don't have to be free. They can be fairly low rent places for people who are, at that stage of their lives. That used to be something that students would do, would live in those. These days it might be somebody who's, trying to overcome some hardship in their life. So that's something you can do if you're so inclined. I think otherwise, participate in your neighborhood associations. Sadly, the neighborhood associations are sometimes dominated by people who are not interested in their neighborhoods changing. And I like people to get engaged with their neighborhood associations and changing their neighborhoods in a positive direction. Just because most houses in this neighborhood, for instance, are single family, doesn't mean that having, a variety of housing would necessarily change the entire character of this neighborhood. There's an 8-plex down the road, there's a duplex there. People don't even really notice, but those types of housing are there and don't really disrupt the neighborhood. So there's always a big concern that the neighborhood will change. What I tell people is, all neighborhoods change in time. The timeline you're talking about is really what matters. It matters a lot whether it changes over 5 years or 50 years. And so I think we are pushing people's comfort zones a little. But I'd ask them to just not be a knee-jerk no, but rather to engage with their neighborhood associations and the cities in particular about what kind of housings might work. You know, how many units are reasonable in a neighborhood of this kind, where might they fit?